So thank you for joining us today. And before we begin, just to wish all who are observing it tomorrow a happy International Women's Day. And also to remind folks that each Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m., we host a Zoom discussion group to talk about the issues that we raise in our sermons. We'll be doing that at 4 p.m. And if you want to join us, there'll be a link in the Facebook comments to that gathering, or also you can contact us via email. So a fellow Franciscan sent me this little booklet in the mail last week, The Salvation of Zachary Baumkletterer by George Mavridis, and printed by no less than the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship in 1976. In its brief 31 pages, and I do mean brief because it's rather small, we learn about how Zachary, our mild-mannered hero, becomes convinced that the most responsible course of action he could take to oppose global poverty and injustice is to model his lifestyle as closely as possible to the conditions of the very poor, owning only one set of clothes, for example, and eating a starvation diet. Unsurprisingly, these choices he was making didn't turn out to be acceptable at all to his coworkers, his middle-class professional circles of society. So they confront him, and eventually this leads Zachary to the assistant director of his workplace, who is very concerned about losing a productive worker in whom the company had made a significant investment. Other attempts to change Zachary's mind having already failed, the assistant director tries to redirect the force of Zachary's convictions toward company policies, such as instituting a no-meat special in the cafeteria and then contributing the money saved to a relief agency. He also teases the idea that Zach could get some press or speak to the Rotary Club, maybe even meet the mayor. Sensing that these appeals still wouldn't satisfy the budding ascetic, the assistant director refers Zach to his pastor, whose job, as established religion's job it often is, was to return Zach to his respectable and comfortable position in society. To his surprise, the good pastor discovers that it was actually two speakers who spoke at his very church that had initially set Zach on his path. First, there was an economist who insisted that loving our neighbors as ourselves obviously entails guaranteeing our neighbors an income large enough to live on. And second, a writer who put the cruelty of social injustice into real-life terms by describing the human beings who were suffering. At first, the pastor pushes back on this. Well, Zachary, aren't you taking things a little too literally? Maybe, and he wrote, you need to give him a little room for rhetoric and interpret him a little more reasonably. Because, we must remember, systems of oppression almost always present themselves as reasonable, natural, even inevitable. We're allowed to have our radical ideas about equality as long as they are just ideas, held in the abstract, and not actually threatening the systems that profit off of our suffering. There's more to this little story, but I'm going to skip to the end. For those who remember the tale, Zachary's quandary is meant to evoke the gospel story of Zacchaeus. Baumkletterer means tree climber in German, and the tale is named, after all, the salvation of Zachary Baumkletterer. Our modern Zach didn't climb a sycamore tree, but he did get a glimpse of Jesus in the words and witnesses of an economist and a writer. So all the time we're reading this little tract, we are led to believe that Zach's salvation, like Zacchaeus, would be in his wholehearted embrace of social justice, in the redistribution of his wealth, and living in solidarity with the poor. But that's not how this modern tale ends. Zachary, starving himself, collapses at his desk, nearly dead, and is admitted into a psychiatric hospital. There, his solidarity is judged as not merely misguided, but pathological. The tale ends with these words of reassurance from a doctor. I can practically guarantee that Zachary will be as good as new, fully cured. Some of the treatments we have now are just amazing. And when the hair grows back over his temple, you won't even be able to see the scar. I wasn't expecting an old IVP tract to arrive in the mail, and I certainly wasn't expecting it to make its way into a sermon, but it stayed in my mind. I mentioned that it was printed in 1976, which also just happens to be the year in which I was born. I've spent my lifetime, literally since childhood, trying to navigate these same worlds and even these same questions. Jesus and the prophets always beckoned me to stand up to oppression and injustice, even and especially when I was complicit in it, and to practice radical hospitality, compassion, and love and community with others. This vision of salvation was countered by misunderstanding and even sometimes ridicule in many of the same ways that Zachary encountered initially. And there was always the not-so-subtle threat of rejection that might be in store if any of us had a little too much success at fomenting for justice. In the end, I think society found more efficient ways to keep most of us in line than the fate our imaginary hero suffered. But, the end result has been largely the same, only the scars are different. I've been turning this little cautionary tale of Zach the tree climber over in my mind alongside this week's gospel reading. I happened to check out the lectionary, and it comes from John chapter 2, which is another familiar story and a favorite one for us activists, really hard to pass up. It's when Jesus turned over the tables at the temple and generally just made a big scene. In John 2:13 through 16, we read this: "The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling doves, 'Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace.'" Growing up in my little Southern Baptist culture, this incident was mainly used as a proof text by those who were opposed to anyone selling anything at church. Eventually, their arguments ended with a compromise, at least for visiting musicians and evangelists. They could sell their tapes and CDs if they set up a discreet professional table in the foyer, but never, ever, ever in the sanctuary. Children with candy bars and popcorn for school fundraisers or scouts with their cookies were advised to keep that stuff in the parking lot, lest we turn the Father's house into a marketplace. These little purity wars missed the point, of course, but I think this was also by design. Yet it wasn't until seminary that I found the tools to develop an appropriate understanding of this text, but even then, I had to go looking. It's much easier for society held up by huge disparities and injustice to sustain itself if we don't have the tools to critique and resist it. When injustice is woven into the fabric of life, it becomes commonplace, acceptable. It's difficult to even imagine that life could be organized in any other way. And because disrupting and subverting this order of things brings with it the risk and reality of provoking the wrath of the powers that be, we may even discourage each other from exercising our imagination that another world is possible. And this is why Jesus' actions in the temple were so surprising. A lot of people have gotten this backwards. They act like Jesus showed up at the temple one day and was just shocked to see people selling doves and changing money. A moment's thought would show just how preposterous this is, as if Jesus had never been to the temple before, or that the whole commercial enterprise magically materialized in between his trips there. No, the temple activity was utterly normal. Buying and selling, changing money, and making a profit, all these things were normal. A system that worked to keep the peasants in line while propping up the ruling class, that was normal. It was Jesus who was surprising, and it was Jesus who was dangerous. In contrast to several other rabbis and teachers at the time who advocated for regulating those systems in an attempt at greater fairness, Jesus went even further, and to use Ched Myers' words, called for an end to the entire cultic system, symbolized by this overturning of the stations used by these two groups. They represented the concrete mechanisms of oppression within a political economy that doubly exploited the poor and unclean. Not only were they considered second-class citizens, but the cult obligated them to make reparation through sacrifices for their inferior status, from which the marketers profited. Isn't that the way things still work today? Think of all the people who are considered second-class citizens in the United States and around the world. And then think about all the extra work our society expects them to do to just be able to exist. All the oppression that has to be managed, all the expectations that have to be met, all the changing and hiding of oneself so that you can fit in. We may not be buying doves or cattle, but we're expected to sacrifice our well-being in order to appease the concrete mechanisms of oppression within our own political economy. As in Jesus' day, we find that oppression is commonplace, and it will be our resistance to and liberation from it that is shocking. After all, those of us living in the United States, we live in a nation that insists that it can never, ever afford, it's impossible to afford a living wage, endlessly putting off, for example, the very reasonable demand for $15 an hour. All the while, we can always afford to go to war, the most recent violence being President Biden's decision to bomb Syria. This nation insists that it can never, ever afford to provide health care as a human right, all the while far and away maintaining the largest military budget in the world. According to the National Priorities Project, the United States has a military that is greater than the next 10 countries combined, more than rivals like China and Russia, and more than allies like Saudi Arabia, the United Kingdom, and France. And this nation insisted that it could never, ever afford to properly address the COVID-19 pandemic because the economic risks were greater than the health risks involved. And that mishandling had meant that 40% of COVID deaths in the U.S. that happened from March to January were preventable. Approximately 200,000 people murdered by our collective arrogance, crumbling infrastructure, economic and social disparities, resurgent racism, an incompetent administration, and similar injustices. All of this could happen, and most of us not even blink an eye, because the oppression is normal, embedded in almost every aspect of our society. And yet society as a whole expects those who suffer racism, sexism, disableism, classism, gender and sexuality antagonisms, and the like, to not only endure this mistreatment and marginalization, but to do so with an absolute and nearly angelic patience. Oppression is not polite, it's brutal and ugly. But oppressors have something that the oppressed don't have. They have the power and wealth to hide that brutality and disguise the suffering it inflicts. And oppressors have the power and wealth to feel relatively unthreatened by our demands for justice, so they can afford to be calm and insist on niceness. This is why, for example, dozens of friends, colleagues, and allies traveled to Jefferson City just this past week to testify against and protest legislation discriminating against and harming transgender youth. This session in the Missouri legislature, there are nine bills to be considered targeting transgender youth, which are some of the most vulnerable people in our state. And you should just, out of basic compassion and human dignity, have equal rights. But all of us transgender and gender nonconforming folks are a favorite target of the political right and have been for some time. So we have to do this every single year, year after year. And we are expected to be courteous while we ask nicely for the state to do its job and stop oppressing us. And while we wait for their decision, we are expected to patiently endure the bullying, assaults, and other direct violence that's common in our communities and families. These patterns are repeated in, I think, all other oppressive systems, so that oppressed people are expected to not only absorb the oppression, but also absolve those who participate in it while waiting patiently for them to change. Marcus Borg called this kind of cruelty everyday injustice. Writing about Jesus in the temple, Borg explained Jesus' choice of words. He wrote, "In Jeremiah, the meaning is apparent. It was a den of robbers precisely because it had become the center of an oppressive system that did not practice justice, but exploited the most vulnerable in society. It was an indictment of the powerful and wealthy elites of his day, centered in monarchy and temple. Their everyday injustice made them robbers, and they thought of the temple as their safe house and place of security. Thus, when Jesus called the temple a den of robbers, he was not referring to the activity of the money changers and sellers of sacrificial animals. Rather, he indicted the temple authorities as robbers who collaborated with the robbers at the top of the imperial domination system. For Christians complicit in injustice, the version of Jesus that's much safer to handle, much less disruptive to their profit margins, is the one that allows them to believe that Jesus was really and ultimately more concerned about whether you could buy a candy bar at church than he was concerned about how to put an end to exploitation of the masses by the rich and powerful. For them, it's an uncomfortable fact that for Jesus and the prophets, greed is not a virtue, and the vulnerable of society deserve protection. The prophet's role was to point this out in whatever ways were necessary, always insisting on being heard. Unfortunately, it turns out that people are not, generally speaking, great at listening, especially when listening would force them to choose between knowingly continuing to doing something unjust and giving up power, profit, status, or convenience to make things right, which it turns out is also why the prophets were often doing such outrageous things, from Isaiah preaching in the nude for 3 years as a symbol of captives of war, to Jesus turning over tables in the temple. Sometimes, when we have grown so accustomed to injustice, only something outrageous will jolt us out of our ignorance. Walter Wink pointed out that the word John used for driving out the commerce in the temple is the formulaic term for exorcism. Jesus was participating in a model for the exorcism of collective evil. And the point of collective exorcism, Wink wrote, is not in the first place reform, but revelation, the unveiling of unsuspected evil in high places. You might expect, but such unveilings are rarely popular. Often, they are deliberately shocking and inconvenient by design. When I lived in Cambodia, I had the good fortune to be part of a broad network of creative and persistent activists and organizers facing some of the most difficult, intractable conflicts and injustices in the world. One of the more famous actions of environmental activists there was felling a tree that completely blocked a very popular highway. The irony was brilliant. They cut down one tree to shut down an entire highway, and with it, the economic activity of everyone who used that highway. By doing so, they called attention to all the trees that were being cut down, bringing with them the destruction of rainforest ecosystems and indigenous communities. But shutting down the highway, it made so many people so angry, and the activists were constantly at risk of physical attack. And it wasn't an imaginary risk. Since 2005, around 20 environmental activists in Cambodia have been assassinated, and many more have been put in jail, assaulted, or otherwise threatened. So, is it worth it? Does it make any difference? That's a complicated question with answers that are often measured in decades rather than days. But generally speaking, the answer is a resounding yes. For example, another brilliant tactic used in Cambodia since at least 2002 is for Buddhist monks to ordain trees. The monks' community forest has now protected 71 square miles of land in northeastern Cambodia, a biodiversity hotspot. The monks cooperate with the residents of 6 local villages, whose residents all use the forest, to patrol the area against things like illegal logging, making it the largest community-managed conservation site in Cambodia. Its continued success is based on a shared conviction that to cut down a tree or hunt wildlife within an ordained forest is considered as serious as harming a monk. Closer to home, we can already see how, for instance, the Black Lives Matter movement has not only helped unveil the evil of police violence, but also began to decrease it. Though the results were not universal, a study just released in February of this year by the Social Science Research Network demonstrated that cities where Black Lives Matter protests have been held experience as much as a 20% decrease in police killings, resulting in an estimated 300 fewer deaths nationwide in 2014 to 2019. Those cities were also more likely to adopt policies such as body cameras and community police initiatives. And this progress is despite widespread demonization of the movement. As Aislinn Pulley, co-founder of Black Lives Matter Chicago, insisted, we should use that knowledge to know that the work we're engaged in, the movement, the advocacy, the organizing, is what we need. And that needs to expand and get broader so we can join much of the rest of the world in having 0 police killings. We can get there. That takes continued and persistent organizing. We can get there. It requires creativity, cooperation, flexibility, persistence, and love. But the fact that humans and human systems can change, that's very hopeful. It is realistic for us to dream of living in ways that transcend our suffering and oppression. Every generation must learn that this is doable. Every generation must braid, so to speak, its own whip of cords. We can draw attention to whatever forms of oppression are considered normal and acceptable. We can name them, we can resist them, and we can put justice into practice in our hearts, homes, and communities. I began by reflecting on one notorious troublemaker, Jesus of Nazareth, and I'll conclude by reflecting on a more recent one, Anne Braden. Reflecting on her own participation in anti-racist work, she wrote this near the end of her life. The first task of whites in these struggles is to be vocal and visible. Often those of us who think we have seen the light on race tend to sit and examine our own souls. That may be a good thing for us to do, and it may make us feel better, but it's not going to bring one iota of change in the conditions under which most people of color live, or do anything to bring people together across the divide. We must speak out and act publicly, and thereby break through what seems to be the solid wall of white resistance. In every age, no matter how cruel the oppression carried on by those in power, she went on to write, there have been those who struggled for a different world. I believe this is the genius of humankind, the thing that makes us half divine, the fact that some human beings can envision a world that has never existed. Perhaps no one living today will see a major change, but it will come. And living in that world that is working to make it happen lets us know that our lives are worthwhile. It was this insight, or one like it, that I think inspired Jesus to overturn those tables in the temple in his day, and inspires Buddhist monks to ordain trees today. When we understand what is at stake, we cannot stand idly by. We cannot permit people to earn less than a living wage for their labor. And we insist that $15 an hour, that is just the beginning, not the end, for our fight for dignity, gratitude, and respect for the working class. We cannot permit entire generations of people to be crushed under student debt. And we insist on not only debt forgiveness, but tuition-free higher education to help level the playing field between rich and poor. We cannot permit people to be without access to quality health care, and we insist on forgiving medical debt and establishing universal health care as a basic human right. We cannot permit voter suppression, gerrymandering, and campaign finance laws that tilt the scales in the favor of the wealthy, and we insist on fair voting access for everyone. We cannot permit the continued brutality of everyday racism, and we insist on dismantling white supremacy in our communities, schools, governments, laws, police forces, businesses, organizations, churches, and everywhere else where we encounter it. We cannot permit the continued destruction of the earth, and we insist on addressing climate change and working together to restore the health and integrity of our living, beautiful, and precious planet. We insist on all of this and more for the full rights and dignity of all people and an end to oppression and exploitation. As Aislinn Pulley put it, we can get there. That takes continued and persistent organizing. So we'll continue to unveil the evil of all these things, to say it out loud, and live our way into another world. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.